There's a question about the MCR. Is the midpoint MCR really necessary?
Oh, I know why you're asking. I am going to say yes. So just a little recap in relation to the within a placement, one MCR is mandatory required. By that, I mean that the final MCR has to be completed to allow you to sign off the end point of the learning agreement and therefore produce a report from the AS that goes forward to ARCP. So that one has to be undertaken. The only reason the second or the earlier midpoint wasn't mandated is because we felt that since there were some existing 4 month placements, that it was perhaps too much. Now, some people have managed to do it within 4 months, do a midpoint and an end, but a lot of people felt that that might be too much. So I would say that midpoint MCRs are only needed in placements that are 6 months or longer. And when I see that, I know people go, well, you know, I'm going to be placed for 12 months, but I'd divide it into 2 learning agreements. I'd think about things as learning agreements, and the shorter that if you reduce it down to a 6-month learning agreement, the development will be better because you'll do it one over 6 months and one over the next 6 months, as opposed to just one point at the midpoint and one that gets lost towards the end. That, by dividing into 6 months, allows for 4 MCRs a year, and that it does give you good development. We're seeing the evidence that suggests if you have a midpoint MCR, the developments and the positive aspects of your end MCR, and therefore the achievement of your objectives within your final learning agreement, is better. So there is showing evidence that the MCR is beneficial. Why would you undertake it? Because an early midpoint MCR can show the targets for development, highlight some aspects, show what you're going to get out of the placement, and address whether or not the trainee is on track. So, you know, that's an early self-assessment, show where you're from your gap analysis, what needs to be developed, and therefore you can see whether or not that has occurred either within that placement or early in the next learning agreement. So the other aspect is that it helps ensure, by raising it early, that the trainee's learning style, again coming back to it, but making sure that can be considered within the early in the learning agreement within that placement, in case there needs to be a change in the way the trainee is taught, in a change of teaching style. I would stress to people to remember that if you're going to do it, make it count. And so if you are doing a midpoint MCR, it needs to be completed before the midpoint learning agreement's been signed off. If it gets slightly out of sync and the lead CS doesn't get it signed off before the AS thinks I'm going to do this, then you can't utilize it. It gets signed off, but the AS is the person that ultimately signs it off, so they should be able to get that synchronization sorted out. And reminding that if you've done a midpoint MCR, you can't think, well, I've done my one MCR for this placement, I don't have to do another. The link, the signage linkage, and that's just the way we worked it out from a technical aspect, so it does exist, but also we think it's really important is that final MCR is linkage that has to be done to enable the final learning agreement to be signed off. From a trainee's point of view, I wouldn't want people to worry about finishing a placement and then suddenly finding, oh, my supervisor hasn't been able to sign it off and I won't be able to start the next one. You can start a new placement without having signed off and completed the previous one, and we actually found that there are a fair number of people whose placements are signed off, the learning agreement signed off, the final MCRs being signed off at 120%, so 20% after the placement gets, but it is getting signed off, and that, so I wouldn't be too concerned about that linkage. And the other thing I was going to say for the trainers and the leads, yes, it is also that you'll get instructive feedback from the midpoint MCR, or giving instructive feedback. It's really helpful for the trainee to potentiate their progression, so highlight it as early as possible, get the most out of that placement. And again, and I've referenced this point before, but I think it's really important at any feedback session to be identifying some action points, some really substantive action points to enable training to concentrate on something point forward development. Likewise, if I was a trainee, I'd be feeding back at that point in the feedback session to give points of development that relate to learning style and how trainers might be able to do things better.
Thanks a lot. That's really been very helpful.